Good morning, Dr. Entwistle. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Sir Brian. Yes, I can.
Good. And obviously you can see me.
Yes.
Good. You're at home, are you?
I am indeed, yes.
And I think it's just your wife who's there in the house with you, or?
No, in the house, yes, but I have, next to me, I have my stepdaughter, Dr. Sarah Kundu.
Thank you. Now, in a moment or two, after you've been sworn, you'll be asked questions by Miss Scott. You're talking to an audience here, a select audience, which is quite small, but there is a much larger audience, well over 100 probably, who will be listening to you online. So bear that in mind. That's who you're talking to, people who want to hear what you have to say. But first, I'm going to ask Oliver to ask you to take the oath. Oliver.
Please state your full name.
Dr. Colin Carruthers Entwistle.
Thank you. Please raise the Bible in your right hand. And finally, please repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Miss Scott.
Dr. Entwistle, can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can indeed.
I'm going to start with a brief overview of your career. So you qualified in 1958, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
And you then had various junior doctor roles in Bristol, moving into pathology in 1959.
Correct.
And by 1963, you'd been appointed a lecturer in pathology at the Welsh National School of Medicine, which was a post you held until 1968.
Yes.
And that post was part-time teaching, was it, and part-time clinical work?
It was mostly laboratory and with some clinical involvement, yes.
And your witness statement tells us that during that period you ran the routine 24-hour blood transfusion service for the Welsh National School of Medicine.
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us what that entailed?
The School of Medicine was based at what was then the Cardiff Royal Infirmary, and my role was in fact looking after the blood bank of the Royal Infirmary, although I had a dual role in that I was also part of the Welsh National School of Medicine.
And then in 1968, you were appointed consultant hematologist and deputy director of the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre. That's
right, yes.
And I'll come ask you some more detailed questions about that in due course. And then between 1974 and 1980, you were the deputy director of the National Tissue Typing and Research Laboratory in Bristol.
Yes.
And then in May 1980 until September 1995, when you retired, you were the director of the Oxford Blood Transfusion Centre.
Yes, indeed.
I'm just going to run through with you some of the committees and working groups and some of the meetings and so on that you attended during your career. So from 1980, when you were appointed the director of Oxford, you were a regular attender of the regional transfusion director meetings. Is that right?
Yes.
Again, as the director of the Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre, you also attended the regional meetings of the Western Division.
Yes.
In March 1981, you were elected to serve on the Care and Selection of Donors Working Party by the Western Division of the Regional Transfusion Centres. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in March 1990, you were elected again by the Western Division to be the representative on the committee, to be their representative on the committee considering the retention of records.
Yes.
And then you were elected the chair of the Western Division regional meetings in July 1991.
Yes.
And you also sat on the National Blood Transfusion Service and the CBLA Liaison Committee from 1991 to 1994.
Yes, I did.
And you were also part of the National Directorate's National Management Committee between 1991 and 1992.
Yes.
And then you became a member of the NBA, the National Blood Authority's executive, from its first meeting in October 1993 until around July 1994. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we also have a record of you attending a handful of liaison committee meetings between the regional transfusion centres and BPL in 1993, which was a committee which was badged as an NBA committee. Is that right?
Yes.
And your CV also tells us that you were a member of the British Society for Immunology, the British Society for Histocompatibility and Immunology, and a founder member of the British Blood Transfusion Society.
That's correct.
Turning then to your time in Cambridge as Deputy Director between 1968 and 1974, when you arrived there, was Dr. Darnborough the Director, or was he?
Yes.
Did he arrive just after you arrived?
No, he had been made director of the Cambridge Centre 2 years before I was appointed. And in fact, because of that, he had not had a holiday, and I was dropped in it in my first week in Cambridge because Dr. Darnborough took a holiday and left me there to look after things.
So do we understand from that that the Deputy Director was a new post?
Yes, it was.
And your witness statement tells us that you were primarily responsible for donors and running donor sessions. Is that right?
Yeah.
And if we just look at your witness statement, Paul, please, it's WITN 6917001. If we go, please, to page 4. We can see what you say there in paragraph 8, about a third of the way down that paragraph. My main role concerned practical organisation of blood donor sessions, including the training of session doctors, including conducting many donor sessions myself, helping the head nurse with recruiting and training of donor attendants, dealing with donors who had medical problems, mostly acute or mostly actual or suspected anemia, and responding as well to any complaints received. And then you say, I also took part in on-call rotas, dealing with management of, over to the next page please, out-of-hours provision of blood and blood products to hospitals in the East Anglian hospitals.
That's correct.
In relation to the your work on on-call rotas, can you tell us a little bit about what that involved?
At that stage, the arrangement was that there would be a night porter on duty for out-of-hours services, and he would call whoever was the doctor on call for out-of-hours consultation, and that meant most of the time I did not have to go into the centre, but at least authorise the provision of what was needed or what had been requested, provided we had it, which we nearly always did, and authorised, if necessary, the emergency transmission using a blue light.
So this was requests from hospital blood banks for products or components that the transfusion centre held?
Yes.
And is it at that stage, did the transfusion centre have regular deliveries to the hospitals that it served?
Oh, yes, we did.
So this was on top of if they'd run out of something or they needed something special?
They'd run out of something special, perhaps, was required, which was not held in stock in the hospital.
If we then look at a document, DHSC 0101582, this is a Department of Health document, and it's actually page 4 page 7 that's of interest. It's a table rather, entitled Hospital Blood Banks Serviced by Regional Blood Transfusion Centres in England and Wales. And if we go down the left-hand column to East Anglia, we can see there it says number of NHS blood banks serviced, 12. Number of private hospitals serviced direct, 0. And then it has a star next to that saying plus two armed services hospitals. Now, this document is dated May 1982, but does that accord with your recollection of the number of blood banks that the Cambridge RTC was servicing during your time?
Could you excuse me a moment? I do some mental calculations. Yes, that seems a fair approximation, I think.
Can you describe for us the facilities, what the facilities were like at the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre during the time that you were there? What the centre itself was actually like and the laboratory services and so on?
The building itself was relatively new because the new Addenbrooke's Hospital had only been opened a couple of years beforehand, and the transfusion centre was within the grounds of the new Addenbrooke's. It was a two-storey building with laboratories on the upstairs section and also the director's room and my own room and secretary's room, and there was also a small lecture theatre. Downstairs there were further laboratories concerned with the processing of blood components and also storage facilities for the mobile blood teams.
And what use was put to the lecture theatre by the transfusion centre?
It was used when needed for training purposes mainly.
And training of internal staff, or was there training
yes, training of internal staff, yes.
Was any training undertaken of hematologists or other clinicians in transfusion medicine from at that stage? No,
not that I can recall.
Turning then to the donor sessions themselves, again, probably the best way to take this is to look back at your witness statement, Paul. It's WITN 6917001. And if we turn, please, to page 6, at paragraph 9, you say this: blood collections by EARTC, and EARTC is East Anglian Regional Transfusion Centre, is it? Was that the correct, the proper name for Correct. The Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre?
Well, originally it was the Blood Transfusion and Immunohematology Centre. That was the title it had been given.
So blood collection by EARTC were organised on the basis of collection teams. Each team comprised a team leader and up to 8 donor attendants, a clerk from the donor registry department and 2 drivers. A doctor attended the session independently. And just pausing there, you say in your witness statement that that doctor was sometimes you. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And the teams went out from Monday to Friday. Teams would travel to pre-arranged venues throughout the region where the RTC donor organiser had recruited volunteer local donor organisers and had secured suitable premises and publicity. And teams under the control of a senior, more experienced donor attendant set up usually 8 beds for actual blood collection and a comparable number of couches for donors to rest after donation. The clerk was responsible for implementing questioning of incoming donors, and one of the drivers undertook the donor's simple copper sulfate-based finger prick blood test for possible anemia. The doctor performed all venopunctures and managed any medical problems such as donors fainting, etc. And as part of this pattern, donor sessions were usually held in a Cambridge venue on Monday mornings to provide fresh blood to be sent to the Papworth Hospital for heart operations. So is it right to understand from that there were no donor sessions in the transfusion centre itself? They were all out in the community?
As a routine, that is correct. Very occasionally, over long bank holidays, we did have the facilities with a few beds, which we could call donors in specially to come into the centre. But that was not a routine procedure.
And was that usually as a response to low stock?
No, as I said, particularly for long bank holidays, where we anticipated there would be difficulties in having fresh products over several days without routine collections coming in.
And is it also right to understand that during your time at the East Anglian or Cambridge Transfusion Centre, there was no plasmapheresis programme?
No, not at that stage, not as I recall.
Do you recall whether or not there were any sessions at which military donors were bled? So we saw in that chart that there was, you were providing components and blood to military hospitals. Were there any specific military donor sessions held?
There were, yes. We visited 2 military establishments, and in fact I personally attended one of those sessions, which proved incredibly beneficial to the service.
And were those sessions undertaken, do you recall, throughout your time in Cambridge?
As far as I can recall, yes.
And did you hold any sessions in prisons?
No, none at all.
And did you or any of your colleagues at the Blood Transfusion Centre give any consideration to whether or not the military donors may pose a higher risk of transfusion-transmitted infections than the general donor population? Was that part of the thinking at that stage?
At that particular time, as far as I can recall, they were not perceived to impose particular extra risks, whatever people might have thought subsequently.
Just one last issue to ask you about in relation to your time in Cambridge, and that's in relation to hepatitis B. You tell us in your statement that while you were there, you devised a detection method for hepatitis B antigen, which you used personally on donations 6 months prior to it being adopted for all incoming donations at the Cambridge Centre. I'm just going to ask you a handful of questions in relation to that. Can you recall whenabouts it was that you developed this, the detection method for hepatitis B antigen?
I can't remember the exact date, but first of all, I was aware that there was a phenomenon which was described then as the Australia antigen, and that was what subsequently was known as the hepatitis B antigen. And I got in touch with a Japanese gentleman who had made the possibility of providing me with some of this, the antibody to that antigen. Now, I won't go into the details how we got round to getting in touch with this Japanese gentleman, but he did actually let me have some serum, which I collected from him when he came into Heathrow Airport, and I used that to try to see whether I could identify any donors who may have carried the actual virus antigen itself. And for quite a long time in my earlier struggles with this, no, there was nothing. And then, sure enough, inevitably, I did find a serum which did react with this Japanese antibody, and that was my first experience of finding the hepatitis B antigen in a donor.
And so is it right to understand from what you've just said that this was at a time before there was screening for hepatitis B within the centre?
Yes, oh yes, this is long before there was any screening anywhere in this country.
What kind of test was it that you were using?
I used to prepare Petri dishes, and there would be rows of holes made in agar sitting in the Petri dish. In one row of holes would be the antigen, the antibody from the Japanese gentleman, and in the center hole of the three would be the donor plasma. There was also a third row, which I won't go into. But if there was a positive reaction, there would be a little line developing between the donor plasma and the Japanese plasma when an electric current had been applied across the gel. I hope this isn't too complicated, but it would take about 20 to 30 minutes for the electric current to do what it required to do. And because of the different electrical properties of the virus itself and of the antibody, the two would be encouraged to join, and that would produce a line in the agar gel. And that would indicate a positive reaction.
And we've heard evidence about different kinds of tests over different periods of times, ELISA tests, RIA tests, PCR tests, and so on. Would the test that you're describing and that you're describing be described as one of those kinds of tests, or was it a different kind of test?
It was different to the others. It was an I can't remember the title now. Immunophoresis was the procedure used, as opposed to a radioimmunoassay or ELISA test.
And just so that I understand, the acronym for that is IEOP. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
And how did that test compare to the later tests that were rolled out throughout, as we understand it, throughout the regional transfusion centres for hepatitis B, in terms of specificity and sensitivity?
In terms of specificity, it was totally accurate. In terms of sensitivity, I cannot tell you because I did not do a comparative study. All I do know is that I had developed a test which did indeed pick up some positives. Whether it would pick up all, I do not know, but at least it would pick up some.
And did you say in your witness statement that you personally were using it for about 6 months before it was used on all donations within the centre. Why was that? Were you testing it for yourself during that 6 month period?
Yes, I was doing it purely as a personal research project.
And if you picked up a donation that was positive at that stage, what steps would you take?
The immediate thing would be to remove that donation from any possibility of it being issued. And obviously I could have considered sending it away for further tests if further tests were available, but of course initially they were not. So all I could do at that stage was to remove it from circulation and make sure that nobody got it.
And was anything said to the donor?
We had no choice but to say, yes, we have a problem here. It appears that you may have picked up an infection, and we had to undertake initial counselling at that stage and refer them on to firstly their general practitioner, and he or she in turn would consider the necessity of referring further to a specialist.
And that was the case, was it, even though there was no confirmatory tests? So even in those early days, those were the steps that were taken.
All we could say was that this person appeared to have a problem, for which there was no treatment at that stage anyway, and we had no way of doing anything further.
Did you take any steps yourself to share the work that you'd done, the research that you'd done, and your findings in the test with other centres?
Not initially, no, I didn't.
And you, of course, weren't a director at that stage, so weren't attending the regional transfusion director meetings. But do you know whether Dr. Darnborough informed his colleagues and so on that this work was being done in the Cambridge Centre?
I don't think he did in the early months when I was doing this purely for myself. Whether he did afterwards, I think he probably must have done, because after I'd been doing this work for a few months, he arranged for that same procedure to be extended to become a routine procedure, and it would have been more than sensible to have alerted his colleagues in other centres.
So you say it would be more than sensible. Do you know whether he did alert his colleagues?
I do not know.
So you don't know whether or not it was adopted by other centres?
I do not know.
If it had been adopted by other centres, do you think you would know?
Very possibly, but on the other hand, I was also aware that other tests were being developed and came into more routine use in other centres. I'm not sure whether any other centre actually adopted the technique that I had used.
And was your test then replaced by a different test in the around about 1972, or was your test used as far as you recall for the whole period that you were, up until you left the Cambridge Centre?
Yes, as far as I can recall, that was the only test being used for hepatitis B.
Until you left in 1974?
Yes.
Could you help me with this? There was something which I have picked up, the acronym CIEOP, counter immunoelectroosmophoresis. Can you explain that to me and how that works in comparison with IEOP?
Yes, I did refer very briefly to a third row of holes in the agar gel. And the idea of that was that in the middle row would be the donor serum, the plasma. In one row would be the Japanese antibody serum, and in the third row, ultimately, when we had a positive, known sample, that could be put into the third row. The reason being then that when you apply the electric current, if there was a positive antibody at all in the donor plasma, that would react with the antigen in the third row, which, if you like, is going in the opposite direction to the little precipitation line that I referred to first of all. So in that sense, hence, counter electrophoresis.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to move on now to ask you some questions about your time in Oxford. So you, as we know, became the director of the Oxford Transfusion Centre in May 1980. You took over from Dr. Gunson, is that right?
Correct.
And you tell us in your witness statement that when you arrived, you had a staff of about 120.
As far as I can recall, that's correct.
And that you were accountable to the Oxford Regional Health Authority, is that right?
Correct.
And that remained the case throughout your tenure at Oxford?
No. Once the National Blood Authority was formed, much later on, they took over I was responsible to them rather than to the Regional Health Authority.
And that was right at the end of your
Yes.
of your time there, wasn't it? 1993.
Correct.
Just to get an idea of
I thought it was 1995, you said earlier. Retirement.
yes, retirement 1995. Sorry, that wasn't
You mean
clear.
1993 for the accountability?
Exactly.
When the MBA began.
Exactly. Can we look, Paul, please, at NHBT 0006265? This is just, Dr. Entwistle, to get a snapshot of the work being done by Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre. So we can see that this, if we look at the bottom of that page, it's a document dated the 10th of May 1990. And if we look at the top of that page, we can see that it's a Department of Health Medicines Inspector's summary of the Oxford Regional Blood Transfusion Centre. If we look then over the page at page 3, please, under introduction, Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre opened in 1979, is connected to the John Radcliffe Hospital. Now, just pausing there, is it right to understand that, in fact, what happened in 1979 is that the Transfusion Centre moved to new premises in John Radcliffe Hospital? It had existed before, but in the Churchill Hospital.
That is correct, yes.
And then it goes on. Although the centre has its own self-contained area on a single floor, there are security problems arising from access to the main hospital on one side and to the engineering plant rooms on the other. The RTC serves a population of about 2.69 million, collected around 114,000 donations in 1989, and employs 202 staff. So again, just pausing there on the 202 staff, does it sound is it right that there was a significant increase in staff during your time there?
No. I said earlier I thought it was about 120. I may be completely wrong. I honestly cannot remember.
So it is likely that your estimate in your witness statement was a bit too low, but the staffing remained about the same during your time there.
Yes, as far as I can recall, it was. There was no significant increase or decrease.
Then if we go down to paragraph 3, we can see the senior staff list. We can see you there as medical director. Then you have a scientific services manager or deputy director, a quality manager. What was the responsibility of the quality manager?
when I was appointed director, there was very little generally in the way of quality management in the transfusion service that I was aware of. And we certainly did not have a quality department as such within the Oxford Transfusion Centre. However, as time went by, and this is not a document from the earliest part, I forget what date this document was.
This is May 1992. No, sorry, May 1990.
Yeah, well, that's quite a bit later. And there was no quality department as such to start with, but it was felt later on that it became imperative and someone had to run it. And initially, my colleague, Dr. David Collins, was involved as quality manager.
And then we see there donor services manager, and you tell us in your witness statement that that post was brought into being by you as a result of a restructuring arising out of poor practice. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you were referring to in terms of poor practices?
I suspect what had happened is that over the course of time, the system in place was possibly not as tight as it should have been. And it was necessary to make sure that things were done better for everybody's sake, not only to make sure that the staff knew better what they were doing, but also, and more particularly, to make sure that the donors were dealt with in an appropriate manner.
And then running back down the list of senior staff, we can see there's donor organiser, blood collection manager, 2 laboratory managers, and then the heads of the 4 different laboratories, standard reagents, donor grouping, microbiology, and blood products. And then if we go over the page, we can see what the list of products that were provided by the centre in 1990.
In 1989?
Sorry, 1989. Thank you, sir. We've got whole blood, plasma-reduced red cells, SAGM red cells. So we can see there that that is the largest, most significant number of units issued at that time. Was that something that increased during your time there, the number of SAGM red cells?
Yes, it was. Initially, we didn't have any, but developments took place that a different additive could be put in with the anticoagulant to make sure the blood doesn't clot. And the additive was SAG, which is abbreviation for some chemicals which enable the red cells to last healthily for rather longer in storage, as a consequence of which the expiry time for red cells was extended from 3 weeks to 5 weeks.
And was another benefit of SAGM that you could remove more of the plasma, and so you were able to send more plasma or use more plasma, send more plasma for fractionation?
That is correct, yes.
And then we've got filtered red cells, platelet concentrates from 2 different methods. And then we have there a number of cryoprecipitate 50 units issued. Just pausing there, you tell us in your statement that Oxford had stopped making cryoprecipitate when it moved to the new centre in 1979. Was that a decision that was made before was it made before you arrived at the centre?
Can I make a correction, please? At the time I wrote my statement, you will realise that this was over 26 years ago. In fact, it was over 30 years since I arrived at the centre. And I honestly could not remember cryoprecipitate being made during my time in Oxford. Now, that may sound very bizarre, but that is the fact, and that is I made that statement in true faith. So obviously, small amounts, small numbers of cryoprecipitates were being made, but as I said, I have no recollection of that.
It may be obvious, the answer to this question, given what you've just said, but do you recall having any discussions with the clinicians at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, for example, about provision of cryoprecipitate?
I have no recollection of any such discussions at all.
And you say that, and looking at this, borne out by looking at this, that only small amounts of cryoprecipitate were issued by the Regional Transfusion Centre. Would it have been possible to increase the issue of cryoprecipitate had there been a demand for it and had you been asked for it?
Obviously, if it had been required and we were the centre producing them, yes, we would naturally have done what we could to meet that requirement.
And would you have been able to increase cryoprecipitate, the production and issue of cryoprecipitate? How quickly would you have been able to increase the production of cryoprecipitate? Would that, if you'd been asked, would the time be measured in weeks or in months?
Depending on how much of an increase you're talking about, it would be very quick, because it could be done literally in a matter of a day or so if it was required. I may add, if I may, one further document which I was sent, which I read, I think it was last week, which showed that in 1988 there were 140 units of cryoprecipitate being issued in the course of a whole year. So you can see that it is not a massive charge on the requirements from the laboratory.
Turning back then to the document we were just looking at, the 1990 inspection report, NHBT 306265. If we look then, yes, so we've got blood collection and receipt. Standard blood donations are collected at mobile donor sessions throughout the region, all teams being based at the centre. Sorry, this is 6.1. And there is also a donor apheresis clinic in the RTC. And then some detail is given about that in the following paragraphs, equipped with 8 machines, 560 donors on the panel, about 105 being bled per week, and plans to increase the numbers so that platelet concentrates will be predominantly produced by apheresis. Can you recall how often donors on the apheresis panel were bled?
As far as I can recall, it was certainly 3 monthly, may well have been less than that, because one is only taking plasma off and not taking off the red cells, so they're not going to risk anemia, which an ordinary donor would. Because of that, one could actually quite safely take plasma and platelet donations off monthly, if that was deemed necessary.
And can you recall how those donors were recruited?
I cannot remember the practical details. I would imagine that because we had donors living within reasonable striking distance of the John Radcliffe Hospital, they may well have been invited through donor sessions to look at documents which would allow for the possibility of their coming into the transfusion centre for considering apheresis.
And can you recall whether there were any additional checks or steps taken in selecting those donors to ensure that they were healthy and free from infection, from viral infection?
I think there was very little in the way of additional medical supervision. I do know that there were tests of liver function introduced at a later stage, and for very good reason, but initially they were really virtually the same inspection as routine donors. But times did change over the course of my being in Oxford. And it certainly changed since.
And then if we go, we see that if we go back to that document, NHBT 306265, and at the bottom of that page, there, donor records are now computerised, so we're in 1990, now computerised and have been since 1988. Records for the following week's donors are printed each week and held in the clinic. When a donor attends and he has signed the consent form, the session sheet is manually filled in with the name, donation number and group, and so on. And then if we go over the page, just one more reference I want to pick up. Mobile sessions 6.1.2. Donors at mobile sessions are mainly called pre-printed computer-generated record sheets being taken to the session. Typically about 200 donors will be called to a session with an attendance rate of about 50%. For new donors and walk-ins, yellow record sheets are used, the appropriate information being handwritten in. So does that accord with your recollection that you got about a 50% turnout rate for donors that were pre-called to sessions?
That seems a reasonable figure, yes.
And how common were walk-ins, can you recall?
On average, I would say that the walk-ins, as you call them, would be about 10% of the total attendance at a donor session.
Now, I'm going to come back to this document in a little later on today, but we can take that down for now, Paul. So, in relation to donor sessions, you say in your statement that there were no donor sessions held in prisons during your time in Oxford. Is that right?
Perfectly correct, yes.
And
the decision had been taken nationally not to use prisons quite some time before I came to Oxford.
So is it right to understand then that by the time you were a director in 1980, were you aware of any other centres undertaking donor sessions in prisons by the time you were a director in 1980?
No, I was not aware of it. In fact, I was, more than that, I was aware that it was a national policy not to use prisons by that time.
And did you have any sessions bleeding military donors while you were at Oxford?
Not that I can recall.
I'm going to turn now to the issue of your targets. Is it right to understand that there were, in effect, your targets in terms of how you decided how many donations you needed to collect were made up of three separate elements, the first of which was your target that was provided to you by either BPL or the National Directorate as to the amount of plasma that you needed to provide to send for fractionation to either BPL or PFL?
That was one of the targets, yes.
And in relation to that, I'll just run through the three and then I'll go back and ask you some questions about them. Another part of the target was made up, was it, of your estimation as to the amount of blood you would need to meet the needs of the local hospitals that you served?
That's correct, yeah. And that was obviously very much based on past record of likely requirements, and that, by and large, really worked very well.
And again, I'll come back and ask you a couple of questions about that. And then was there also, we heard from Professor Contreras last week that there was a contract between the Oxford Centre and her centre in London, North London, to supply them with blood and components. Did that also form part of your target setting? Or did you simply provide them with whatever you had spare?
I would imagine this was probably happening on the latter basis before I got there, but by the time I arrived, we provided Edgware with Dr. Contreras' Centre. We provided them with blood on a regular basis.
And so is it right then that would have also formed, you would have factored that into your targets for the year?
Correct, yes.
So just...
And I think that if I can expand a little on that, it's only fair to say that because we in the Oxford region did have the resource we could easily, or relatively easily, find the donations that Dr. Contreras wanted, whereas obviously Edgware was having a problem.
And why was that? Why was it that you could find the donations relatively easily?
I suspect purely population demographics.
So you never had, throughout your time there, would have always been able to collect more donations had they been required?
Yes, I think we probably could.
Just turning then to the first of those targets, the national target, the target set by BPL and or the National Directorate, what input did you have into that target? And by you, I mean the centre.
We didn't have an input in deciding how much was required. I think it is fair to say that the BPL was challenged with finding sufficient raw material to provide for products needed. And they divided up the total requirement into proportions provided by each of the transfusion centres. So a big centre, for instance, would provide a lot more plasma than a small centre. And consequently, we were given a target by BPL. This is what was felt appropriate to be provided by the Oxford Centre, if possible.
And so was there a check in with you to establish whether or not that was a target you could meet? Or you simply just provided it and expected to get on with it?
Not really. We did just that. We got on with it.
And then turning then to the second target, the target that you set to meet the local needs, I think you've already said that worked quite well, that it was based on previous years' experience. And was it also based, did you have discussions with your hematological colleagues in the blood banks that you served as to what the needs of their particular hospitals were?
Not in specific detail, but I think it is fair to point out that totally outside our normal routines, both for us or the hematologist, the hematologist of the whole region used to meet about every 3 months or so in a semi-domestic arrangement, maybe talks or discussions, and that gave good opportunity for face-to-face discussions, to raise questions, to ask questions, and so on. But apart from that, there was no formal review.
I've seen reference to the regional blood club meeting 4 times a year in the
That's
area.
right.
Is that what you're describing?
That's correct. That's correct.
And I'll come on to ask you some questions about your interactions with colleagues later on this morning. Turning then to the contract you had with North London, just to ask you a little bit more detail about that. You told us that that was an arrangement that started before your time. And in your witness statement, you link the ability to collect donations from the Slough area with the arrangement to provide blood to the Edgware Centre. Why is that? What's the relevance of the collections in Slough?
Well, the Slough area was geographically a part of the Oxford region. And we were therefore, the Oxford Centre was therefore bleeding donors from that area. And it seemed in some senses logical that, if you like, those donations could go back home, as it were, to the Edgware Centre.
So
In fact, there was a discussion between Dr. Contreras and myself on more than one occasion. She asked, would there be any possibility of them taking over the Slough area? But in fact, we left things as they were.
Can we look then at a document on this issue, which is NHBT 0111632. So this is a record of a meeting of the heads of department, and I understand that to mean the heads of department within the Regional Transfusion Centre, is that right?
Correct.
And
yes.
we see some of the names that we just looked at on the senior staff list in the inspection report. If we look at the bottom of that first page, rationalisation of sessions at 3, Dr. Entwistle had met with Dr. Contreras and a representative from the North West Thames BTS to sort out the requirements for Edgware. It had become apparent that although fresh whole blood would be very nice, if we can go over the page, what they really wanted was platelets. The RHA had agreed that it was not ethical to bleed donors and discard all the red cells. As a result, there was now no justification for Oxford to think of increasing red cell collection, and Dr. Entwistle pointed out that there was therefore no justification for retaining the 5th team. Ideally, there should be 4 full teams, i.e. 48 DAs on the road. And then you go on to discuss what the 4 sessions would look like. Is it right to understand that at that stage there was no ability on the part of Oxford to collect platelets by apheresis?
That is correct, yes.
And so the only... So while you had the ability to collect whole blood donations that would have met the needs of Edgware, because that would have required you to get rid of the red blood cells that weren't needed, that was unethical, and so you couldn't help out.
Correct.
And can we just look then at another document, please? DHSC 0038579_016. And this is another document on the issue of feast, if I can put it that way, in one area, yours, and famine in others. And this is an issue that seems to have made its way into the press. So we've got here 2 articles, date stamped 12th September 1987, one on the left from the Daily Telegraph and on the right from the Guardian. It's the one from the Guardian that I'm going to turn to, and it's entitled "Minister Denies Blood Shambles." And these were articles that were written in the wake of then Dr. Cash's article in the British Medical Journal in which he described the blood transfusion service as a fragmented and disorganised shambles. Now, we've looked at this article in previous hearings, so we're not going to turn that up. But you were contacted by and spoke to the Guardian journalist, and we can see what you say on the right-hand column. So if we can pick it up sort of a third of the way down where it starts, one of Professor Cash's central criticisms that coordination is so bad that one region is cutting blood supplies while another faces shortages was confirmed yesterday. And then Oxford has cut back despite a shortage of more than 100 pints a day in the South London region. Oxford's regional director, Dr. Colin Entwistle, said there was no way we could justify collecting vast excesses of blood that nobody wanted. That is why we cut back. So this article in 1987 is picking up on a slightly different point to the one we looked at previously, which was that you were cutting back on donor sessions even though you could have collected more donations at a time when there was a shortage, apparently, according to this article, in the South London region. Were you aware during your tenure, and particularly in 1987 when you were cutting back on donor sessions, that there were shortages in other regions?
You had two issues there. Two issues there. One was cutting back. We only decided not to move on to a fifth blood collection team. We could have, if it had been required, obviously it would have gone ahead. So we were not actually cutting back in that sense. We maintained our normal collection, which included some going to Edgware. We were not aware that South London was that desperately short, and we hadn't been approached by them to see whether we could help them as well. So even though they may have been short, we were not involved in that.
So do you think, looking at it now, that the fact that you weren't even aware that there were shortages in another area was a product of the regionalisation of the transfusion service? Had there been had it been a truly national body with one body overseeing all of the centres, that may not have occurred?
Certainly, and I think this did underline the need for proper rationalisation of the service, which ultimately led to the formation of the National Blood Authority.
Moving off the issue of targets then onto the issue of what you did with your plasma in Oxford, is it right to understand that Oxford provided plasma to PFL in Oxford, which was a historic arrangement in place when you arrived at the centre?
Correct.
And the plasma that was fractionated by PFL was provided directly to the Oxford Haemophilia Centre as Factor 8 or Factor 9 or whatever products they were making. And those products did not make their way back to the Regional Transfusion Centre.
That's correct. At no time did the Transfusion Centre hold stocks of Factor 8.
Or what about Factor 9?
Or any of the coagulation products.
Is this also correct that Oxford also provided plasma to BPL at Elstree, and again the products that were made out of that plasma, Factor 8, Factor 9, went again direct to the Oxford Haemophilia Centre and did not come to the Transfusion Centre? Correct. And did that remain the case throughout your tenure at the Transfusion Centre?
PFL, so Plasma Fractionation Laboratory in Oxford, in fact, relinquished its role to the BPL.
So is it the case that, in fact, the Oxford Transfusion Centre didn't hold any PFL or BPL or commercial products.
Correct.
So the only blood products or blood components that that the centre held were those made at the centre themselves. So the your cryoprecipitate.
The cryoprecipitate is the only product which the Oxford Transfusion Centre made available to the Haemophilia Centre.
So all the, if I can call them products, all the products that were held by the Transfusion Centre were those that were made at the Transfusion Centre?
Yes.
Did the centre have any input or any discussions, or any input into the decisions made by the Haemophilia Centre about purchasing commercial blood products?
No, we had no part in that at all.
Moving on then to look at supply of blood and components from the Transfusion Centre. I'm going to go back to the document that we looked at earlier, DHSC 0101582. And if we look at the table we looked at, which I think was on page 7. Thank you. And if we look down the left-hand column, we can see Oxford, number of NHS hospitals served 11, and no private hospitals, but we've got there 2 RAF and 1 USAF hospital. Does that accord with your recollection?
That is not correct. There are a number of private hospitals in the Oxford region to which we also provided small quantities of blood.
So this is a document from 1982. In 1982, do you think this was incorrect?
As far as I can remember, there were private hospitals. Whether they were in their 1982, I'm not sure.
Certainly, we have a document.
Certainly, I'm sorry.
No, I don't want to.
Can you let him finish?
Yes, absolutely.
Certainly, towards the end of my time, I was very well aware of there being private hospitals because we had to negotiate with them for contract purchases. But I was also aware that that at least some of them had been there prior to that. And I'm very surprised to see this figure 0 in that chart.
Certainly, we have a document from 1992, which is from a medical audit visit by Doctors Robinson and Hewitt to the Oxford Centre, which I don't think we need to go to, but for the benefit of the transcript, it's NHBT 309748_001. So it's a medical audit from 1992 in which it said that the centre served 10 district general hospitals, 2 RAF hospitals, 1 US Air Force hospital and 14 private hospitals. So by 1992, it looks like 14 private hospitals. Does that sound more accurate to you?
That accords with my recollection, yes.
And can you recall whether there was a period, as you went through your tenure, that you picked up more and more private hospitals, or do you recall always having private hospitals?
Initially, there was very little in the way of private hospitals. And in any case, even at the end, they did not figure largely in the demands made on a service.
And did you provide any blood or components to any other NHS services, such as dentists?
No.
So just hospitals?
Yes.
I'm about to move topics, and it's going to take me, I think, more than 3 minutes. I wonder whether now is a good time to break.
Yes, well, we normally take a break mid-morning about now, Dr. Entwistle, for about half an hour to allow people to have a cup of coffee, those who are at home to make themselves some refreshment or indeed just have a break. So we'll take a break now. We'll come back at 11:45, if that's okay. Let me tell you what I tell every witness at this stage, and it's this. You're giving evidence. What you must not do is discuss the evidence you have given, or for that matter, any evidence which you think you might be asked to give, with anyone, whoever that person is, whether family, lawyer, anyone at all. But you can talk about anything else you like. So I look forward to seeing you at 11:45. 11:45.